Okay, so yesterday we were talking a bit about Greek mythology. I mentioned a few stories, mentioned some gods that you need to be familiar with. In particular, you need to know who Zeus is. He's the king of the gods, god of thunder in the sky, and he's also king of not staying loyal in his marriage. His wife, Hera, the queen of the gods, is the goddess of marriage, which makes that kind of ironic. He has many, many children. Many of the Greek heroes are children of Zeus. Then there's Apollo, the god of the sun. There is Artemis, the goddess of the moon and hunting and archery. Poseidon, god of the sea and brother of Zeus. Hades, god of the underworld and brother of Zeus. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, particularly strategy, also a child of Zeus. Ares, the god of war, who is like the black sheep of the family. And then Aphrodite, goddess of love. There are a lot of gods that I didn't mention that you're not expected to know every single one of them. For example, Dionysus, the god of debauchery, partying and drinking far too much, really. Hermes, the messenger god. Hephaestus, the blacksmith god who makes all of the weapons and armor of the gods. And Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, and many, many others also exist. So basically, all of these myths and legends, these stories of gods, the Greeks use them to explain the world around them. They explain the fire and lava from volcanic eruptions, for example, as being the forge of Hephaestus, the blacksmithing god. They explain lightning and thunder as being Zeus hurling lightning bolts at the earth. They explain the sun moving through the sky by saying that the god of the sun, Apollo, who's also the god of music and literature, they explain it as he attaches the sun to his chariot and he carries the sun through the sky on a chariot. So these mythological stories are all an effort by the Greeks to explain natural phenomenon that they don't have a scientific explanation for. They, like many ancient peoples, have to try and explain to the best of their abilities. Arya, yes, that's also true. Dionysus is a god of like wine, but more broadly a god of debauchery, drinking, partying, things like that. Yeah. His cults got up to some pretty wild stuff, especially like later in the Roman Empire, because most of the Greek gods are translated into Roman gods, or have parallels in the Roman pantheon. Many of the stories are the same or very similar with different names. For example, in Greek mythology, Zeus is Zeus, and in Roman mythology, he's Jupiter, but it's still basically the same god with similar stories. Aphrodite becomes Venus in the Roman mythology. So they still very much exist and are still very much a part of the civilizations. The Romans took a lot of inspiration from the Greeks. And obviously, this is all sort of combined and seeped into modern civilization. It's not like all of this and these concepts went away. We still tell a lot of the stories that the Greeks told. Obviously, we have scientific explanations for things. But the impact is still there, is still very prevalent in our society as well. Now, Greek mythology isn't just about gods and goddesses. Now, they're pretty much involved in every single story in Greek mythology, but it also includes stories about heroes. Many of their stories are about great heroes. For example, Theseus, who traveled to Crete and killed the Minotaur. And you can also see that the Minoan civilization sort of bled into Greek civilization in this way. There's also the story of Hercules, which is probably the most famous of the stories. And I don't recall if we talked about this in this class yesterday, but many of you have probably seen the Disney movie Hercules, yes? Sound familiar at least? Yes? Thought most likely you had. Yes, I had like 5 people in my first class that did not know that movie and had never seen it, so it's not a guarantee. If you haven't seen it, that'd be something good for you to probably watch over the Mardi Gras break in the next few days. They have not lived. I know it's wild. Uh, so, those of you who are familiar with that version of the Hercules myth, it is not, it has elements of the original story in it, but it's not by any means the same story. In fact, in the original myth, Hercules is actually a son of Zeus and a mortal woman because Zeus did that a lot. Hera, the wife of Zeus, hates Hercules. One of the greatest lies Disney ever told was to imply that Zeus was somehow a good family man who was like loyal and loved his wife and things like that. That's not how that worked. So Hera often punishes the mistresses of Zeus and their children because jealousy, and she doesn't seem to really punish Zeus for his behavior, just the women and children in those relationships. So yes, they do in that Disney movie make you think that Hera is Hercules' mother, and that is not the case at all. But it's a Disney movie, so it's making an effort to make the story more child friendly. In the original myth, of course, Hercules is the child of a human woman and Zeus, and he is a demigod. So here's the thing: Hera despises him. So Hercules is actually living a relatively normal life. He meets a woman named Megara, who is also a character in the Disney movie. They have several children, and then Hera drives Hercules mad, and in a fit of rage, Hercules murders his entire family. That wasn't in the Disney movie. Yes. Yeah, unexpected, right? And then when he realizes what he has done, he's horrified because, of course, he is. He was suddenly out of his mind and has committed this terrible act. And so he actually wants to repent, and he goes to this Greek king who's also being manipulated by Hera. And this king sends Hercules on, I think it's 12 missions or tasks to try and sort of earn forgiveness, repent for his crime. So Hercules does all these fantastical tasks. He kills the Nemean lion. There's one that involves a girdle and Amazons. Some of them are exceptionally dangerous, and he was expected to die. He fights a Hydra. But he manages to succeed, and eventually Hercules himself becomes a god and ascends to Olympus and marries a goddess and goes on with his life. But the original I love the quote, Dakota. The original story is obviously much more dark than you would be led to believe in the Disney version. But yeah, if you haven't seen that movie, go check it out. It's worth watching. So Hercules is probably definitely the most famous and well known of the big Greek heroes. Now, on the topic of Greek literature is still very much relevant in the modern world. We typically don't read like a ton of literature from like ancient Egypt, but we still read Greek literature. For example, a poet named Homer actually wrote 2 epic poems that are very, very well known. They are called the Iliad and the Odyssey. You need to be familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey. By the way, you need to know what those are. The Iliad is loosely based on what we now believe to be an actual event, which is the siege of the city of Troy. Now, I'm quite certain that the events of the story, which involve a lot of gods being involved in fantastical events, aren't what actually happened in the real historical event. But we do have reason to believe that a city called Troy was sieged and destroyed. And so the Trojan War is something we think did actually happen. That being said, this story centers on a particular hero named Achilles. You may have heard that name before. We have a tendon at the back of our foot on our heel called the Achilles tendon. And the reason for that is this. At the beginning of the Iliad, Achilles' mother, a minor goddess, I believe her name was Thetis, actually, Achilles is a demigod too. Most of these heroes are demigods of some sort. She dips Achilles in like this magical water that makes him invincible. And but she has to hold him by the back of his foot at that tendon in order to do so. And so that's a weak spot for Achilles, and if he is struck there, he will die. And that's what happens to him at the end of the Iliad. Achilles is killed in that way, and so even to this day, you have an Achilles tendon. It's based off of the Iliad. So this is really seeped into modern culture in ways that we don't even realize most of the time. So that story, the Iliad, is about the Trojan War and a bunch of very complicated events that I do have a video I'm going to attempt to show you that kind of breaks it down and is pretty amusing in my personal opinion. And the second of the poems that Homer wrote was called the Odyssey. And you have probably heard the term Odyssey before. It refers to like a great hero's journey, a long journey. And that comes from the Greek, and that comes from the name Odysseus, who is the main hero in that story. And Odysseus actually fights in the Trojan War in the Iliad. So he's a character in both of the poems, but he's more prominent in the Odyssey, which is about his attempts to get home from Troy after the end of the war, because he upset Zeus in the story, and Zeus being petty, because all of these gods are terribly petty and flawed and get involved in things and just make a mess. Zeus is angry at him, and he's making it very difficult for him to return home. And then he upsets Poseidon because he kills one of Poseidon's sons, the Cyclops, and which was a monster that tried to eat him and a bunch of his men. So basically, gods are getting in the way of Odysseus getting home, and Athena decides that, like, okay, we're going to cut him some slack, and she starts helping him get back home. But it's like a 10-year journey for Odysseus in the story to return home to his wife and his son. So he's been away for a very long time, and the story centers around his just the trials and tribulations that he faces trying to get back home. It's a pretty good one. I enjoy the Odyssey quite a bit. Any questions about the Iliad or the Odyssey before we move on? Good. Now, other Greek literature you need to be familiar with. The Greeks were fond of what we call lyrical poetry. That's where the term lyrics comes from. The words to songs are called lyrics. And that's because these lyrical poems sung or performed by lyric poets were played, like they played a stringed instrument called a lyre while they're speaking the poem. And so lyrical poetry becomes very, very popular in ancient Greece. One of the most famous of these Greek poets was actually a woman named Sappho. She came from an island called Lesbos, which, by the way, you should know that homosexuality is really common in ancient Greece. Like, it's just a big part of the culture and considered to be a normal thing. So that if you start doing research on a lot of these topics, you're going to come into contact with a lot of that sort of content. Sappho actually writes a lot of stories about love and her relationships and things like that. A lot of it's lost to time, but in her time, she was really popular. There are statues dedicated to her. And while that doesn't sound all that big of a deal to us now, women weren't revered like that in ancient Greece. So for her to have been very popular, even though most poets of the time were men, is really quite telling. And we have managed to recover some of the works that she performed in those days. Another poet you need to be very familiar with. Hang on. Got to back up so I can read your comment. Okay, there we go. Another person, not a poet, that you need to be familiar with is Aesop. You've probably heard this name before. We're not actually sure if Aesop was a real person or not, but there are a large number of fables, which are stories that teach a lesson of some sort. There are a lot of fables from ancient Greece that are attributed to Aesop and collectively called Aesop's fables. One of them that you're probably familiar with is the tortoise and the hare. Almost everyone's heard that story, and a lot of people don't realize that's an ancient Greek fable. So anyway, a lot of these stories, these fables from Greece, are collected together and attributed to someone named Aesop that we're not even sure if it actually was a person, or if the Greeks just decided to kind of collect all these Greek stories together and turn them into the works of one individual. We don't know. We're really not sure if Aesop's a pen name or if that was a real person. But obviously, all this Greek literature has continued to have a big impact on our society in a way that you wouldn't even realize it if you didn't know the history there. And that's actually the end of our discussions for Chapter 8 on ancient Greece. Anybody have any questions?